I inherited a 900-acre lake ranch that had belonged to my family for generations, fully documented with original deeds, boundary surveys, and water rights, and I was living peacefully until an HOA woman deliberately ignored those records, dismissed repeated warnings, ordered contractors onto my land, built a massive mansion along the lake as if she owned it, mocked everyone who questioned her authority, and unknowingly set herself on a path that would cost her the house, the land, and everything she thought HOA power could protect. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The ranch wasn't just property on a map. It was memory layered on memory, written into the soil long before HOAs, zoning committees, or glossy community brochures existed. My grandfather bought the land when it was considered useless by developers, too rocky near the water, too isolated for quick profit. What they saw as inconvenience, he saw as freedom. He built a modest cabin by hand near the lake, fished every morning before sunrise, and taught my father that land isn't something you dominate, it's something you protect. By the time the ranch passed to me, the paperwork alone filled several boxes, deeds recorded and re-recorded, boundary surveys updated every decade, water rights filed with the state and reaffirmed after every regulatory change. This wasn't inherited confusion, it was inherited certainty. The lake itself was part of the ranch's identity, its shoreline carefully preserved even as surrounding areas began to change. For years, I lived quietly. I paid my taxes, I maintained the fences, I let neighbors walk the outer trails with permission. I stayed out of disputes and kept to myself. When nearby developments began popping up, complete with gates and uniform mailboxes, I didn't interfere. Progress happens, people move in, communities grow. None of that bothered me. What bothered me was entitlement. The first hint of trouble came as a rumor. Someone mentioned at a local store that a luxury build was planned near the lake. I didn't think much of it. Plans get floated all the time, developers talk big, projects fall apart. But then another neighbor mentioned seeing survey flags closer to the water than they should be. That caught my attention. I drove out to the lakeside that evening expecting maybe a misplaced marker or an overzealous contractor. What I found instead was something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh stakes planted well inside my boundary line, bright tape fluttering in the wind where no tape had ever been before. I checked the coordinates against my records. There was no mistake. Still, I stayed calm. Mistakes happen. Boundaries get misread. I assumed a simple conversation would fix everything. I called the county the next morning, confirmed the parcels, and asked if any approvals had been filed that affected my land. The answer was immediate and clear: no. That's when I heard the word HOA for the first time in this situation. Apparently, the nearby community's homeowners association believed a section of my lakeside land had somehow become part of their jurisdiction. There was no transfer on record, no easement, no sale, no annexation. Just belief, confidence, assumption. A few days later, she showed up. She didn't introduce herself like someone coming to resolve a problem. She introduced herself like someone delivering a decision that had already been made. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, tone sharp and dismissive. She informed me that construction would be beginning soon and that I should avoid interfering. I asked her to clarify exactly what she meant. She gestured toward the lake and said that the HOA had approved a private residence there and that all necessary permissions had already been handled. When I told her the land was mine, she smiled. Not a polite smile, but the kind that suggests amusement at someone else's ignorance. She told me HOAs had authority over all surrounding land and that old deeds didn't matter anymore. I offered to show her the documents. She declined. I suggested we contact the county together. She laughed. She said she didn't need county approval when the HOA had already decided. That moment changed everything. I wasn't dealing with confusion. I was dealing with someone who believed power came from position, not law. Someone who believed confidence could replace consent. Someone who assumed no one would challenge her because no one ever had. When neighbors gathered, curious and concerned, she spoke over them. When one older man mentioned remembering my father fishing that lake decades earlier, she dismissed him as irrelevant. When someone pulled out a phone, she didn't stop, she doubled down. She said rules mattered more than history, more than ownership, more than common sense. I told her, clearly and calmly, that no construction was authorized, that the land was private, and that any attempt to build would result in legal action. She looked at me like I had just threatened her with a toy weapon. She said, "You'll learn how this works." Within days, the stakes were reinforced instead of removed. Within weeks, equipment was scheduled, and standing there on land my family had protected for generations, watching someone prepare to take it simply because she believed she could. I realized this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about arrogance meeting truth, and arrogance never wins when the truth is documented, recorded, and patient. The HOA's claim didn't arrive quietly or cautiously. It arrived with confidence so loud it felt rehearsed, as if the outcome had already been decided and my role was simply to accept it. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox one morning, stamped with the HOA's logo and filled with language that sounded official enough to intimidate someone who didn't know better. According to the letter, a portion of my lakeside property had been absorbed into the association's managed area years earlier due to community expansion and governance alignment. There were no dates, no signatures from county officials, no recorded transfers, just words arranged to sound powerful. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the actual proof to appear somewhere between the paragraphs. It never did. Instead of reacting emotionally, I did what my family had always done when faced with uncertainty. I went back to the records. I pulled the original deed from the safe, the one my grandfather had signed decades ago. I compared it with the most recent county plat map. I checked the parcel numbers, the coordinates, the tax assessments, and the water right filings tied specifically to the lake. Every single document told the same story. Nothing had changed, nothing had been transferred, nothing had been absorbed. The HOA's claim wasn't just wrong, it was imaginary. I contacted the county recorder's office directly and asked if there had been any filings, annexations, easements, or quiet title actions involving my land. The clerk paused, typed for a moment, then said something that stuck with me. "Sir, your property has one of the cleanest records I've ever seen." She confirmed that no HOA had jurisdiction over it and never had. Armed with that confirmation, I assumed this would end quickly. I sent a certified letter to the HOA, attaching copies of the deed, the survey, and the county's writ. And confirmation. I kept the tone respectful and professional. I didn't accuse, I didn't threaten. I simply stated facts and requested that any planned construction be halted immediately. Their response came fast, too fast. The HOA woman, now formally identifying herself as a senior officer of the association, sent an email that read less like a reply and more like a warning. She claimed the HOA had internal authority that superseded county interpretation and insisted that disputes would be handled within the association framework. She advised me not to obstruct progress and suggested that resistance could result in fines or legal consequences. That was the moment the situation crossed from absurd to dangerous. HOAs can be aggressive, but they are not governments. They do not override state law. They do not erase recorded deeds. And they certainly do not gain ownership through confidence alone. What she was asserting wasn't just incorrect, it was legally reckless. I drove to the edge of the lake that afternoon, where a few neighbors had gathered. They were uneasy, whispering among themselves, pointing at the survey flags that now multiplied instead of disappearing. One couple told me the HOA woman had been going door to door, assuring residents that everything was handled and that the land dispute was just a paperwork issue. Another neighbor said she warned anyone who interfered that they could be cited for violating HOA rules. The irony was painful. My land wasn't part of the HOA, yet she was using HOA rules to intimidate people standing on property the HOA didn't own. When she arrived again, this time with 2 board members and a contractor, I confronted her calmly. I showed her the county letter. I pointed to the survey markers that had been there for decades. I explained slowly and clearly that her authority ended at the boundary line and that crossing it without permission constituted trespass. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue facts. She simply smiled and said, "We've already decided." That sentence revealed everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be resolved. It was a power play. She believed that by moving fast, projecting certainty, and burying me in procedural noise, she could make reality bend. She assumed I would either back down or be overwhelmed. Instead, I documented everything. I recorded dates, times, names, statements. I photographed every new marker, every piece of equipment staged near the lake. I saved emails, letters, and voicemail messages. When contractors began clearing brush without my permission, I instructed my attorney to send formal cease and desist notices directly to both the HOA and the construction company. The construction company paused, briefly. Then the HOA woman intervened, assuring them she had full authorization, and that any legal risk would be handled internally. Against their better judgment, they resumed, At that point, even neighbors who had once trusted the HOA began to worry. They asked questions at meetings. They requested documentation. They were brushed off with vague answers and warnings about disrupting community harmony. Phones came out more often. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The more pressure she felt, the more aggressive she became. She accused me of trying to hold the community hostage. She claimed the land was abandoned despite my continuous tax payments and maintenance. She even suggested that historical ownership shouldn't matter if it stood in the way of modern development. That statement alone would later echo loudly in court. What she didn't realize, what arrogance often blinds people to, is that every dismissal, every threat, every written denial of clear evidence was strengthening my position. Each email she sent asserting false authority became proof of willful misconduct. Each warning she issued without jurisdiction became a liability. By the end of that month, the HOA wasn't just claiming my land, they were staking their reputation on it. And once an organization commits fully to a lie, retreat becomes impossible. They had crossed the line, not just onto my property, but into a legal battle they were never equipped to fight. The first bulldozer arrived just after sunrise, its engine breaking the quiet that had always defined the lake. That sound alone felt wrong, like something foreign forcing its way into a place that had never invited it. I stood at the edge of the property and watched as the machine rolled past the boundary markers my grandfather had helped place decades earlier, crushing grass and wildflowers without hesitation. In that moment, the dispute stopped being theoretical. It became physical. Within days, the land began to change at a terrifying pace. Trees that had survived storms, droughts, and generations of careful stewardship were cut down in hours. The shoreline was reshaped to suit architectural plans I had never approved. Soil was dug up, leveled, compacted, and poured over with concrete so quickly it felt intentional, as if speed itself was being used as a weapon. The faster they built, the harder it would be to undo. That was the strategy. Build first, argue later, and standing at the center of it all was the HOA woman. She arrived almost daily, dressed impeccably, clipboard tucked under her arm, speaking into her phone like a general issuing commands. She walked the site with the confidence of someone who believed the land beneath her feet answered to her authority. When neighbors approached with concerns, she smiled tightly and reassured them that everything was legally handled. When someone mentioned my objections, she waved them off and said I was confused about boundaries. The mansion itself rose quickly, too quickly. Its foundation alone was larger than most homes in the nearby community. Floor plans circulated among the HOA board, boasting lakefront views, private docks, and terraces that extended directly over land that had never been zoned for residential development. Every feature screamed excess, as if the size of the structure itself was meant to intimidate anyone who dared challenge it. I tried again to stop it without escalation. I met with the construction foreman, showed him the deed, the survey, and the county's written confirmation. He hesitated. He admitted something felt off. But then the HOA woman intervened, pulling him aside, speaking in hushed tones before handing him paperwork she claimed cleared everything. He looked at me apologetically and said his company had been assured there would be no legal consequences. That assurance would later haunt them. Concrete trucks lined up along the access road. Steel beams arrived. Walls went up. Each day the mansion grew taller, heavier, more entrenched in the land, as if daring the law itself to remove it. The HOA woman's confidence grew with it. She began hosting site tours for select board members, laughing loudly, making comments about how people always panic when change comes. Neighbors started filming openly now. The videos spread through the community, then beyond it. In one clip, she could be heard saying, "Once it's built, no judge will make us tear it down." In another, she mocked the idea that inherited land rights still mattered in modern developments. She believed momentum had already secured her victory. What she didn't understand was that every brick laid was another piece of evidence. My attorney filed for an emergency injunction. The court scheduled a hearing. Notice was served. The HOA woman was informed directly that construction could expose her to massive liability. Her response was not caution, but defiance. She ordered construction to continue uninterrupted, insisting that stopping would signal weakness. That decision sealed her fate. By the time the hearing date arrived, the mansion's frame dominated the lakeside skyline. It cast long shadows across the water at sunset, blocking views my family had cherished for generations. The sight filled me with a mix of anger and resolve. She hadn't just crossed a boundary line. She had tried to erase history with concrete and arrogance. At an HOA meeting held during construction, residents began asking hard questions. Where was the proof of ownership? Why hadn't the county signed off? Why were so many warnings being ignored? The HOA woman shut them down quickly, reminding everyone of fines, violations, and community compliance. But the room had shifted. Doubt had entered. Outside that meeting, one longtime resident pulled me aside and said quietly, "She's gone too far this time." Others nodded. Fear was giving way to disbelief. Construction crews began to sense it too. Workers whispered among themselves. Some refused to continue without written assurances. The HOA woman responded by threatening to replace them, claiming delays would be remembered. She was no longer managing a project. She was fighting to keep control of a narrative that was slipping away. The mansion, once a symbol of her authority, started to feel like a monument to her recklessness. And still she pushed forward. The final insult came when she installed fencing that cut off traditional access paths my family had maintained for decades. That fence wasn't just illegal, it was provocative. It was her way of declaring ownership, daring me to challenge it publicly. I did. Photographs were taken, measurements were recorded, trespass reports were filed, environmental impact complaints were submitted. The evidence stack grew thicker by the day. What she saw as progress, the court would later see as deliberate disregard for the law. As the mansion neared completion, the HOA woman hosted a private celebration on site. Music echoed across the lake. Laughter carried through the air. She toasted to winning against outdated claims and spoke openly about how no one had the power to stop her now. What? She didn't know, what arrogance never anticipates, is that the law doesn't care how tall a building is, how much money was spent, or how confident someone feels standing inside stolen walls. It only cares about ownership. And by building that mansion on land she did not own, after being warned repeatedly, after being shown proof again and again, she had transformed what could have been a simple correction into a catastrophic mistake. The house stood there, massive and immovable, convinced of its permanence. But permanence is an illusion when it's built on someone else's ground. The courtroom didn't look dramatic when I first walked in. No grand speeches, no raised voices, just polished wood, quiet benches, and the steady weight of rules that don't bend for confidence or intimidation. That calm atmosphere was exactly what made the moment so powerful. Because unlike HOA meetings or construction sites, this was a place where authority came only from law, not from attitude. The HOA woman arrived late. She walked in wearing the same confidence she'd worn on my land, heels clicking sharply against the floor as if she expected the room to make way for her. She brought a thick binder, color-coded tabs sticking out, and sat down without looking at me. Her attorney leaned in close, whispering something urgently, but she waved him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. She still believed this was just another formality she could talk her way through. I, on the other hand, came prepared in a different way. My attorney laid out our materials slowly and methodically. Original inheritance deeds, some older than anyone else in the room. Certified surveys from multiple decades, all matching perfectly. County plat maps, tax payment histories showing uninterrupted ownership, water right filings tied specifically to the lake frontage, environmental records, even historical photographs showing my grandfather standing on the very shoreline where the mansion now loomed. There was no rush, no theatrics, just facts. When the judge entered, the room stood. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Confidence without substance evaporates quickly when it meets someone who has seen every trick before. The judge glanced over the case file, then looked directly at the HOA woman and asked a simple question. "Do you dispute that the plaintiff holds recorded title to this land?" Her attorney stood, cleared his throat, and attempted to argue that HOA governance created functional authority over the area due to community integration. The judge stopped him almost immediately. "Authority over people," the judge said calmly, "is not authority over land." That sentence alone felt like a crack forming in the foundation of everything she'd built, both figuratively and literally. The judge then asked for documentation supporting the HOA's claim of ownership or jurisdiction. What followed was painful to watch. The HOA woman leaned forward, pointing to internal HOA maps, unsigned documents, meeting notes, and approvals that existed only within the association itself. None of it had been recorded with the county. None of it had legal standing. None of it transferred ownership. The judge flipped through the papers slowly, then set them aside. "These are not deeds," the judge said. "These are opinions." Murmurs rippled quietly through the courtroom. Then came the question that changed everything. Were you warned that this land was privately owned before construction began? There was a pause. Too long. Her attorney tried to answer around it, suggesting confusion, misunderstandings, and competing claims. The judge held up a hand and asked again, this time more directly. Were you warned? That's when my attorney submitted the evidence. Certified letters, emails with timestamps, cease and desist notices, county confirmations forwarded directly to the HOA, video recordings of her dismissing those warnings. The judge reviewed each piece carefully. The longer it went on, the heavier the silence became. What had once been framed as a disagreement now looked exactly like what it was, willful trespass. The HOA woman's posture changed. Her shoulders stiffened. The confidence drained from her expression as the judge asked follow-up questions she couldn't dodge. Why did construction continue after legal notice? Why were survey markers removed? Why were contractors to the HOA would handle any legal issues? She attempted to explain. She claimed she believed the HOA's authority was sufficient. She said she was acting in the community's best interest. She even suggested that stopping construction would have caused financial harm. The judge listened patiently, then responded with words that echoed through the room. Belief is not ownership, confidence is not consent, and community interest does not override private property law. At that moment, the case stopped being close. The judge ruled that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the land, that the plaintiff's ownership was clear and uncontested, and that construction had proceeded despite repeated warnings. That last point mattered most. In legal terms, it removed any protection she might have claimed. Ignorance can sometimes soften consequences. Defiance never does. The HOA woman tried one last tactic. She argued that tearing down the mansion would be unreasonable given the cost and scale of the project. She suggested financial settlement instead, implying that money could smooth over the mistake. The judge shook his head. "You don't get to buy what you knowingly stole," he said. That sentence ended it. The court found that the mansion had been built unlawfully, on private land, that ownership of the structure did not override ownership of the soil beneath it, and that the plaintiff was under no obligation to compensate for construction performed without consent. Additional penalties were ordered for trespass and misrepresentation. The HOA woman sat frozen. For the first time since this began, she had no authority to hide behind. No rules to quote, no fines to threaten, just a ruling she couldn't ignore. When the judge exited, the room slowly exhaled. Neighbors who had attended quietly nodded to one another. My attorney gathered the documents with the same calm precision we'd used from the start. As the HOA woman stood to leave, her binder slipped from her hands, papers spilling across the floor. Internal maps, approvals, assumptions. None of them mattered anymore. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked questions she didn't answer. The mansion still stood by the lake when we left that day, tall and imposing, but something fundamental had changed. It was no longer a symbol of power, it was evidence, and soon it would become a consequence. The courtroom was packed the morning the judgment was announced. Word had spread quickly. The HOA woman who built a mansion on someone else's property was finally facing the consequences of her actions. Neighbors, reporters, and legal observers filled every seat, some craning to see the scene that had become a local spectacle. I arrived early, calm but alert, knowing that after months of intimidation, paperwork battles, and construction chaos, this day would decide everything. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. He didn't waste time with theatrics. The case file in front of him was thick, containing decades of deeds, surveys, water rights, tax records, and correspondence between the HOA and myself. Each page told a single undeniable story. The land belonged to me. The HOA's authority ended at the property line, and the mansion had been built without consent. The judge began by reviewing the timeline, warnings sent, letters ignored, survey stakes removed. Construction continued despite formal cease and desist notices and repeated misrepresentation of ownership. He highlighted the deliberate actions of the HOA woman, noting that she had received certified documents proving my ownership multiple times, yet continued construction anyway. "This is not a case of misunderstanding," the judge said. "This is a case of willful trespass and disregard for the law." The HOA woman's face went pale. Her earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by visible tension. Her attorney tried to interject, arguing that the HOA had acted in good faith, that they believed the property was under their governance, and that financial compensation might be fair given the cost of construction. The judge interrupted sharply. Good faith does not exist when repeated legal warnings are ignored. Belief does not replace lawful ownership. The courtroom collectively held its breath as the judge continued. He ruled that the mansion, though physically impressive, was unlawfully built on private property and that ownership of the structure did not override the legal title of the land beneath it. He ordered that the HOA woman and any parties involved in construction were not entitled to reimbursement for materials, labor, or any investment made. Every brick, every beam, every nail laid without authorization was now at their cost. But that wasn't all. The judge imposed additional fines for willful trespass, including monetary penalties intended to deter future attempts at ignoring property law. He cited the numerous formal warnings she had received, her repeated dismissals of county records, and her attempts to intimidate neighbors who tried to stand up for lawful boundaries. The law protects not only ownership but also the integrity of the system itself, he said. Where arrogance meets evidence, the law prevails. As the decision was read, the HOA woman's expression shifted from disbelief to panic. She realized that everything she had assumed, her authority, her power, her ability to bulldoze over history and documentation, was meaningless in the face of the law. The mansion, once a monument to her supposed control, was legally now a liability. Any attempt to occupy or profit from it would constitute further trespass. Neighbors who had attended the trial whispered among themselves. Some were relieved, others astonished at the audacity and the downfall of the HOA woman. The lesson was visible in real time. Confidence without law, power without principle, and arrogance without accountability leads to ruin. The courtroom buzzed quietly as lawyers packed up and the judge exited, leaving the ruling as a permanent record of justice. The aftermath of the judgment was immediate. Contractors working on the mansion ceased operations entirely. The HOA woman attempted to make arrangements, claiming she would negotiate with me to resolve the matter amicably, but the legal ruling had stripped her of leverage. Every claim she had tried to make, every rule she had tried to enforce, had been invalidated. She had no property rights, no authority, and no legal ground to stand on. News of the ruling spread rapidly through the community and online. The HOA's reputation suffered irreparable damage. Members of the board quietly distanced themselves, and whispers of resignations circulated. Residents who had once been intimidated by HOA mandates began attending meetings openly, questioning rules and leadership in ways that had previously been unthinkable. The case became an example, a cautionary tale of what happens when someone overreaches without legal foundation. The mansion itself stood silent and imposing, its walls a stark reminder of how far one person's arrogance can carry them and how complete it can crumble under the weight of evidence and justice. My land was intact. The lake shoreline was preserved. The ranch, which had been in my family for generations, was safe once again. As I left the courthouse, I thought about the long months leading up to this moment. The intimidation, the threats, the daily stress of watching someone violate my property with impunity. I realized that victory wasn't just about winning the case. It was about standing firm, documenting every detail, and trusting in the system that had been built to protect the law. Arrogance, no matter how loud or confident, could not overcome that. In the weeks that followed, the HOA woman attempted to salvage what she could, but the judgment made it clear she had lost everything. The mansion would either be removed or left as an empty shell at her expense. The HOA had to reevaluate its claims, and the community slowly began to return to a sense of order. Neighbors thanked me privately, some openly, for standing up to what they had feared was an untouchable authority. The court's decision reinforced a truth I had always believed: integrity, evidence, and patience prevail where intimidation and arrogance fail. By the end of the month, the property was quiet again. The machinery was gone, the workers had been paid, or in some cases left unpaid for tasks performed without proper authorization. The lake reflected the sky, untouched by the chaos that had briefly consumed it. And for the first time in months, I could walk the shoreline freely, knowing that justice had been served and that no amount of confidence, influence, or HOA rule could ever replace the power of law backed by evidence. This judgment didn't just restore my property. It restored faith, not in the HOA, which had failed spectacularly, but in the principle that good governance, legal documentation, and patience ultimately prevail. Arrogance may build quickly, but it collapses just as fast when it meets truth. And that lesson, witnessed by neighbors, court officials, and the community at large, would never be forgotten. The courtroom battle was over. The judgment had been handed down. The HOA woman had lost everything, the mansion she had built illegally on my land, the authority she had claimed over property that wasn't hers, and the respect of the community she had tried to intimidate. But as I stepped outside the courthouse, I realized the aftermath would be about far more than just legal victory. It would be about restoring decades of peace, repairing the subtle damages of fear and distrust, and ensuring that the lessons learned from this ordeal were permanent. The first thing I did was return to the ranch. The morning air was crisp, the lake smooth like glass reflecting the sky above. For months, the peaceful silence that had always defined this property had been shattered by bulldozers, saws, and the constant hum of human ambition gone awry. Now, standing at the edge of the lake, I could finally see the full scope of what had been attempted and what had been prevented. The mansion still loomed, a hollow skeleton of steel and concrete, but it was no longer a threat. The court had confirmed that it was built illegally, and that any attempt to occupy, sell, or profit from it would be met with swift legal action. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes. For months, they had watched with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and helplessness as an outsider claimed rights over land that wasn't hers. Now, they walked across the edges of the property smiling cautiously, many carrying small gifts or tokens of gratitude. They thanked me repeatedly for standing firm, for documenting every violation, for never letting arrogance overwrite law. Some spoke quietly about their own experiences with HOA intimidation, how often they had felt powerless, how often they had feared standing up for what was right. Their voices, previously muffled by fear, now carried the relief of validation. The HOA, its LF was in disarray. The woman who had orchestrated the mansion's construction was no longer seen at board meetings. Rumors circulated that she had resigned, attempting to escape the community she had once sought to control. Remaining board members scrambled to issue statements of apology, but their words rang hollow. The damage was done. Their authority had been publicly undermined. Residents questioned every past decision, every rule enforcement, and every guideline the HOA had previously imposed. Confidence in the organization had crumbled alongside the legal defeat of its most brazen member. Restoring the land became the next priority. I worked with contractors and environmental specialists to remove unsafe construction materials, secure the site, and prevent any further trespass. Trees that could be saved were replanted or protected. Wildlife returned to areas that had been disrupted. Each small repair was a symbolic act, reclaiming not just the soil, but the dignity of generations who had protected this land long before HOAs existed. Every step was deliberate, a methodical undoing of the chaos imposed by someone who believed rules alone could override ownership. Community outreach followed naturally. I invited neighbors to walk the property, showing them exactly where boundaries lay, explaining the history of ownership, and sharing stories of my family's stewardship over decades. People listened intently, often shaking their heads in disbelief at the audacity of the HOA woman and her assumptions. Conversations turned into broader discussions about property rights, community responsibility, and the importance of standing firm against intimidation. What had been a personal victory began to take on a communal significance. People realized that law and persistence, when exercised correctly, could protect them as well. The media coverage added another layer to the aftermath. Local news stations and social media platforms picked up the story, highlighting the clash between inherited land rights and HOA overreach. The mansion, empty and unfinished, became a symbol of hubris, frequently appearing in photos and videos that documented both the construction chaos and the subsequent legal triumph. I was careful to frame the narrative around principle, not personal revenge. The focus remained on justice, law, and accountability, an example of what can happen when individuals protect their rights with patience, documentation, and integrity. Meanwhile, the HOA faced internal consequences. The board conducted internal reviews, many members resigning under public pressure. Policies were rewritten, guidelines clarified, and the community was urged to respect the rights of private landowners. While some resisted, most acknowledged that the court case had exposed systemic flaws. What had been a tool for controlling residents became a cautionary tale about accountability and limits of power. Personally, I reflected on the months of stress and tension that had led to this point. The battles had been exhausting, the confrontations often intense, and the fear of escalation ever present. Yet, the process had reinforced core truths: preparation, patience, and adherence to law are stronger than threats and bluster. Arrogance, no matter how loud or confident, always collapses in the face of documented reality. The lessons were hard-earned but invaluable. I realized that this wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about affirming a principle that would guide every decision in the future. The mansion, the HOA, and the conflict would remain as memories, but the land itself, the lake, and the heritage of the ranch had endured. Standing on the shoreline, I could feel the weight of generations before me and the responsibility to protect the legacy for generations to come. The quiet returned gradually. The lake's surface reflected the morning sun, birds returned to the trees, and the occasional ripple across the water reminded me that life continues, even after chaos. Neighbors slowly resumed their routines, now more engaged with the property and each other. Community meetings transformed from platforms of fear into forums of awareness. People discussed property rights, legal protections, and the importance of vigilance, no longer cowed by the shadow of an overreaching HOA. Children played safely near the lake. Elders walked the trails that had been neglected during the construction frenzy, and a sense of shared relief settled over the community. In private moments, I often walked the edges of the ranch alone, reflecting on what had transpired. Each tree, each rock, each stretch of shoreline felt like a victory, not just for ownership but for principle, for persistence, and for the reassurance that right will prevail when combined with diligence. The HOA Woman's Mansion remained a hollow structure, a testament to human hubris and a warning for anyone tempted to ignore laws that protect others. But it no longer threatened me, my family, or the community that surrounded the lake. As time passed, the story of the HOA woman, the illegal mansion, and the legal victory became part of local lore. New residents moving into the area were told the tale as a lesson in caution, respect, and the enduring power of rightful ownership. For me, the experience reinforced a commitment to the land, the lake, and the legacy entrusted to me. Every sunrise over the water, every rustle of leaves in the trees, and every reflection of the sky across the lake reminded me that patience, preparation, and persistence are more powerful than fear, intimidation, or fleeting authority. The ranch, now restored to its rightful state, stood as a quiet monument to what happens when courage meets law, when truth meets arrogance, and when history refuses to be rewritten. And as neighbors, friends, and family gathered to witness the restored beauty of the lake, I understood one final truth: no matter how loud or confident the opposition, the good guys always win when they remain steadfast, prepared, and patient.